Hey, this video contains spoilers for chapters 3 and 4 of Deltarune, so go play those before watching this if that's something you care about. Also like, comment, subscribe, Patreon, all that stuff. On to the video! When you think about it, it's kind of incredible just how big Undertale got. The game's initial goal on Kickstarter was a mere $5,000, and it ended up racking up over 10 times that amount before releasing in 2015 and becoming one of the biggest, most impactful games in history, which is all the more impressive considering just how small it really was. It was kind of a perfect storm, and in time there was barely a gamer on Earth who hadn't at least heard of it. People were inspired to create their own AUs, their own takes on its music, fan games, animated series. There are even developers who cite it as inspiration for their own games. Its impact on gaming culture cannot be understated. Hell, even the Pope ended up owning a copy. Well done, MatPat. The game became so big, so mind-bogglingly, earth-shatteringly massive, that it was almost an entity unto itself. Toby Fox's magnum opus almost began to feel unmatched, as if nothing could truly compare. And then came the first chapter of Deltarune, and people began to talk. And then came the second chapter, and people began to sit up and take notice. And then, nearly a full decade after the initial release of Undertale, Toby Fox released chapters 3 and 4 of Deltarune, and everyone lost their goddamn minds. Everything people loved about Undertale, but bigger, more complex, and more refined, with an intriguing mystery surrounding the identity and motivations of an enigmatic and shadowy knight with ominous and unknown intentions for this strangely familiar alternate universe with all our favourite characters in different places. People could not jump on board fast enough, myself included. But I don't just want to talk about how good the game is, I want to talk about its characters and themes. And there are a lot of themes to unpack in this game. Just to name a few, there's identity, freedom, fate, control, friendship, hope, snacks, the perfection of Jockington. Maybe I'll talk more about those in another video, but today I'd like to focus on the theme of kindness that pervades the game, and to discuss how I think Toby manages to make us sympathize with his characters again and again. Because I have so many fucking thoughts on this masterpiece of a game, and I need to get them out somehow. I think it's safe to say that Toby Fox hasn't lost his touch. The man... dog? The guy has a real talent for making sympathetic, complex characters and exploring them through both narrative and gameplay mechanics. And this was obviously a necessary skill when making Undertale. When the premise of your game is nobody has to get hurt and everyone deserves a second chance, there's a fine line you need to be able to walk to inspire gamers to want to see the characters safe and happy, even after being attacked by them. And while the designs of his characters certainly do a good bit of the heavy lifting, there does have to be more than that. And here's the thing, I could spend a lot of time talking about all the characters in Deltarune and what it is I think that makes them sympathetic and likable, but that video would be a 2-hour long unfocused mess and not very fun to watch or make, and especially not to edit. So I'd instead like to make like the game and focus on our main cast of Kris, Ralsei and Susie. Because as fun as it might be to talk about the supporting cast or the changes made to the returning characters, I think everything important relates back to these three and the journey they take. So that's the lens I'll be examining the game through, with the supporting cast and greater themes discussed as they relate to each member of the fun gang and their personal arc thus far in the story. So let's jump right in, shall we? Starting with... Drag it down and sink you in the deep. Just look up, let the past go, 'cause you're I think it's safe to say that Kris was a bit of a surprise for people. Players were expecting another blank slate-esque character a la Frisk and, yeah, that's not what we got. Of course, that hasn't stopped people from insisting otherwise, a claim that becomes increasingly harder to take seriously as more chapters come out and Kris continues trying to assert their will, to the point that, well, at this point, you at best just look really silly. I can, however, understand where that idea initially stems from. For the majority of Chapter 1, Kris plays almost exactly the same as Frisk does, and that first impression can be hard to shake. From the start of the game to the end of the Dark World, Kris follows our orders and shows almost no personality outside of what we bring out of them. But that's just it. It's only until the end of the Dark World that Kris is like this, because the facade begins to drop almost the second we leave the school. I need to make myself clear here, Kris is not a blank slate. They are not merely there for you to project onto, and the entirety of the third and fourth chapters exists to reinforce that fact. a fact which we begin to see at the end of chapter 1, and I'm not just referring to the part where they rip us out of their chest, but I do think it's understandable that people might think of Kris as a blank slate at first, or that they might think that Kris doesn't have much personality, because the player is fundamentally denied the majority of Kris's characterization by the narrator. The thing about Kris is that they're brimming with personality. We are just not made privy to most of it. Really stop and think about the way the narrator refers to Kris, or rather, the lack thereof. Much like with Frisk, the narrator favors referring to the player over them, to the point that, outside of certain bodily reactions, the only context we get about Kris's feelings comes from how other characters react to them. How Monster Kid says Kris looks annoyed when they insult Susie, Susie's surprise when Kris's toast prompt to Queen is so impassioned, and the way Kris communicates their one-word response to their friends when asked if they're okay after the Spamton fight, either saying yes through clenched teeth or screaming the word no. These are things we as the player would never know if it weren't for the other characters' reactions. There are plenty more, and I'll get to them in a moment, but I feel it's important to note that you can actually get a really good picture of the kind of person Kris is from these small details. And I think it's whether or not you notice these things that will probably decide if you personally find Kris to be a sympathetic character or not. Because here's the thing, viewer, Kris is not wholly innocent in all the goings on of the game, but they are a victim. Obviously, Kris is a victim of the player manipulating their body, but I believe that they're also a victim of the Roaring Night, which I know is a bold claim, but hear me out, and I think you'll find my reasoning to be fairly sound. We don't know what led to the Dreamers adopting Kris, but we do know that they struggled being the only human in their town, as they always used to wear a pair of fake horns that were clearly meant to help them feel like they fit in with their new family better. We also know that despite being something of a little shit, which is kind of to be expected of a kid in their circumstances if we're being honest, Kris was happy with the Dreamers, but that was a long time ago, and while we don't know what caused the divorce, we do know it was fucking bad. And while they still had Asriel to make things better for a time, eventually he left for college. And when we begin the game, Kris is almost completely isolated from the people around them. This is something that I feel gets overlooked when it comes to discussing Kris, since everyone started focusing on the knife and then the dark fountain they made and everything else that came up after. But it's very clear to me that Kris is grieving at the start of the game. People don't really tend to realize this, and this is something I'm going to expand upon when I get around to making that Claire Obscura video. But grief isn't just sadness, and it isn't tied solely to death. Grief is the deep sorrow felt when we incur a loss of something with great emotional significance, whether it be the death of a loved one, the end of a relationship, or the destruction of a sentimental object. And what Kris is mourning, more than just the divorce of their foster parents, is the loss of stability and connection in their life. Playing through the chapters, have you noticed how often people talk about how things used to be with Kris? How their family used to come to the diner after church, that Asriel and Des and Noelle all spent time with them, how the holidays would come over for the holidays, and how Catty used to spend time casting spells with them. Even Bradley is implied to have once been their rival in Smash Bros. Kris had a lot of close relationships, but everything fell apart with Asgore and Toriel's relationship. And at the start of the game, Kris is just alone. What I think happened is that Kris began to withdraw as things got worse, and that, in combination with just how badly the divorce went, left people, especially the kids, unsure of how to interact with them, so they pulled away too. And to be clear, I do not put the blame of this on other kids. Most of them still try to be nice to Kris, but none of them seem to know how to approach or even talk to them. Noelle and Monster Kid do try, but they're both preoccupied with Berdly and Ice Drake respectively, and unable to articulate the nature of their relationship to Kris either way. So Kris is left alone. At the start of the game, Kris is isolated from the people around them, unable to even fully assert their own bodily autonomy thanks to us. And I think this isolation made them an easy target for the Knight. Whether you believe the Knight to be Des or Carol or someone else, it's obvious there's someone who holds sway over Kris. As they give Kris orders over the phone, Kris is clearly letting us back into their body at the Knight's behest, and they can attack Kris without fear of repercussion. And there is something else that people might have forgotten in all this. Kris is a kid. A capable kid that can handle themselves in a fight, but still just a kid. Whoever the Knight is, they're taking advantage of an isolated and grieving teenager to enact their grand scheme, and that's fucking terrible. But I think it's also because of this isolation that Kris ends up being such good friends with Susie, as well as why they change so much over the course of the chapters. Because if you look at the way Kris acts in chapter 1 versus in chapter 4, it's very clear there's been a shift in their behaviour, and I think it comes down to the fact that they're not alone anymore. Kris starts the game as essentially just a puppet for the player, and as of chapter 4 they not only have two very good friends who treat them with kindness, but they've also reconnected with both Noelle and Berdly. And I think it's due to this that not only do they begin to deviate from the Knight's plan, but they show an increasing ability and willingness to defy the player. And I think all of this stems from the events of chapter 2. Chapter 2 was a big turning point in Deltarune, greatly expanding both the gameplay and story. While Chapter 1 was pretty open about its thesis that your choices don't matter and what you do has little impact on the characters, Chapter 2 took that premise and kicked it off the side of a bridge and into a burning dumpster full of rusty nails and used syringes. Because not only did Chapter 2 add the recruitment mechanic, it also added the Snowgrave route, as well as Spamton G Spamton. About halfway through chapter 2, Kris splits off from Ralsei and Susie and runs into a fucked up little salesman who promises them the taste of freedom if they help him, and then fucks off to the dump. And then they run into Noelle, who they form a truce and travel with through the back streets of Cyber City. And it's made very clear through this that Noelle and Kris used to be quite close. They used to spend a lot of their childhood together, and even though Noelle herself isn't quite sure what their relationship really is, she seems really happy when you affirm your friendship, and it's even shown that her time with Kris is really good for her, as having them by her side helps her to build her confidence and courage. It's honestly quite sweet, and I think Kris appreciates having the chance to reconnect as well. Even if there is some awkwardness to it all, they also end the chapter closer to Berdly, who admits to a begrudging respect for them. And all of this is combined with the fact that they went on another adventure with Susie and Ralsei. They're two best friends who are open about their appreciation for and desire to spend time with Kris. I know I kind of brushed over it, but Kris's friendship with Susie is probably the most important factor in all of this. I'll get into more detail when I talk about Susie, but it cannot be understated just how big of an impact Susie's friendship with Kris is. She may start as their bully, but she ends chapter 1 as not only their friend, but also as someone who genuinely expresses the desire to spend more time with them. And when they do spend more time together, it could not be more obvious just how happy she is to do so. Not just to go on another adventure, but to see Kris again, to spend time with them again. When you're a lonely and isolated person like Kris, something as simple as someone wanting to spend time with you means more than the whole world. Susie even spends the night, and it's very clear that nobody has done something like that in a very long time. Despite the events that lead up to chapter 3, it's pretty obvious that Kris is happy with this. I'm not sure exactly where the Spamton fight falls on the scale of canonicity, so if we assume that a normal pacifist run of chapter 2 is considered canon, then Kris is in a much better place when chapter 3 starts than they were at the start of chapter 1. And I think this is why they begin to assert their will more, even while under the player's control. Because the kindness of Susie and Ralsei, along with the happiness of having such good friends, gives them the strength that they just didn't have before. Their friends may not know about their struggle for control, but at least they don't have to deal with it alone. If we do add the Spamton fight to the canon though, then, well, I don't think you need an explanation. Spamton is a mirror to Kris, someone who lost their place and fought desperately for control, only to be broken and cast aside. Kris's reaction to their fight speaks volumes, and their drive to not end up like Spamton would only further spur on their will to assert themselves. I'll be honest, if you played through chapters 3 and 4 and still insist that Kris is just a vessel for the player, just a blank slate, you're either being deliberately obtuse or just a massive fucking idiot. Just like the people who try to argue Kris isn't non-binary, just massive fucking idiots. Because Kris repeatedly fights against player control if you try to make them do something they don't want to. They cough when they don't want to say something. They choose the right answer during Tenna's quiz if it pertains to them. They refuse to tell Ralsei he shouldn't have feelings when he asks, and at one point, they literally just fight you with a hockey stick because they're sick of your shit, player. Especially if you did the Snowgrave. See, this and one other place are actually where I think Kris's personality shines through the most, because unlike the player should they decide to be an asshole, Kris is just not a cruel person. While we don't know the reason Kris is working with a Roaring Knight, and can only really speculate, we do know that Kris doesn't enjoy being nasty to people. In fact, outside of the pranks they play, Kris is actually quite caring. I mentioned earlier that Kris refuses to tell Ralsei he shouldn't have feelings, but it doesn't end there. They also say things to immediately contradict your choice if they think talking about Ralsei's face hurt his feelings. They refuse to say they'll never play the piano again when Susie asks if she ruined their love of it. And they go as far as to violently bite their own hand in the weird route. Kris's kindness and concern for others really comes through here actually, because while they definitely do not like you in normal, they fucking despise you if you've done a Snowgrave route. After Snowgrave, Kris attempts to make things right with Noelle and even brings Berdly to the hospital alone, visiting him later when even his own mother doesn't. Kris tries so hard to make things right, to fix the damage that you cause, and it's clearly because they care about these two. And the knowledge that you're not just controlling their body, but using it to hurt the people they care about infuriates them. During the normal route, Kris goes at you with a stick in the closet, but during the weird route, if you barge in and attempt to coerce Noelle again, Kris has a full crash out in the bathroom, and understandably so. You're a monster using them to hurt people, and they cannot stand that. Outside of the optional bastard nature of the weird route though, there is one thing that I think actually characterizes Kris a great deal, and that would be the pianos. Over the course of the game, you will encounter several different pianos, and the player is able to prompt Kris to play them. However, they simply refuse to, merely slamming the keys and looking angry enough that people feel the need to comment on it. However, this isn't to say they can't play the piano. Multiple characters mention Kris's skill with the instrument. Noelle reminisces on how she'd listen to them and it would feel like a concert. And people even comment on how beautifully Kris used to play at church. And yet, Kris refuses to play for us, to the point that Susie seemingly starts to wonder if people were messing with her when they said how good Kris was. And I think there's a very simple explanation for this. Kris simply refuses to perform for us. Based on context clues, I think that the piano is an incredibly important part of Kris's identity, something that they put an enormous level of effort into mastering. And it may even have been something that they took up specifically to connect with people, to give themselves more of a place to belong in both their family and their community. And so to Kris, being prompted to bare their soul like that to us is probably a massive insult. One they absolutely will not put up with unless it is under the terms of malicious compliance. We can make them hit the keys, but we cannot make them play it for us. But they will play for Susie. During chapter 4, Kris will refuse to play the piano when prompted by us, even though there's literally no way to proceed without it. They would rather completely halt the adventure than perform at our behest. But when Susie asks, when she tells them that she'd really liked them to play, they finally do, and without further prompting from the player. I'm not a cruisy shipper myself, but it's moments like this that I really do get the appeal. I think this, more than anything else, demonstrates just how much Susie and her friendship means to Kris. How she makes them feel cared for, like they can just be their normal, weird self around her without fear or care. That they would play the piano for the first time, apparently in years, because she asked them to. Well, that speaks volumes. And it's because of all of this, that at the end of chapter 4, Kris is struggling between their loyalty to their friends and their promise to the night. A promise we still do not know anything about. There's still a lot we just do not know about Kris because we are never allowed to know their thoughts or feelings directly. But what we do know is that Kris is someone who has experienced great loss, is still experiencing great hardship, and who is becoming more and more their own person. And while we can speculate, we simply cannot know what they will do next. But whatever it is, it will likely finally be what they want. And I think that's the core of what makes Kris sympathetic. Their fight to assert their own identity and protect what matters to them. Also, if Kris really did have as big a problem with going to the festival with Berdly as people seem to think, they wouldn't have let us pick that option so easily. Okay, moving on. So we're all in agreement that Ralsei is Kris's old horns, yeah? Okay, good. Also, do you remember how people used to swear Ralsei was going to turn evil based on nothing other than the fact that it would have been the edgiest possible outcome, and some people find that really appealing for some reason? Yeah, they probably feel silly now. Though to an extent I can kind of see where the idea may have cropped up from, because outside of his status as the goodest boy to grace the screen, Ralsei is most characterized by lack. Ralsei starts the story empty. From the moment he's introduced, Ralsei is associated with emptiness. He's the ruler of a kingdom with no subjects, standing alone in the deserted castle of an empty town. Even his face is kept in shadow for most of the first chapter, depriving him of the ability to form detailed expressions. And when he falls in battle, all that's left is an empty pile of clothing. He barely even has a personality at this point, as he's largely only characterized by his knowledge of the prophecy and his kind, nurturing nature. What's important though is that he doesn't stay this way. Due to his adventures with Kris and Susie and his interactions with other Darkners, Ralsei very quickly begins to evolve into his own person, something he isn't even fully comfortable with at first. And this growth is one of the most important aspects of his character. To properly discuss Ralsei, I'll be going at it on two fronts. The first being his fundamental nature and growth as an individual, and the second being how he relates to the main bosses of each chapter, because each boss functions both as a foil to Ralsei and as a mirror to Lightner, and I think these parallels are important. It's worth noting that outside of the visuals, the OST also reinforces Ralsei's emptiness. The two tracks we're meant to associate with him in Chapter 1 are Empty Town and The Legend, which I think makes perfect sense. Ralsei was born alone and with no sense of who he is, something he acknowledges himself in Chapter 3, but with an encyclopedic knowledge of both the prophecy and the nature of both darkness and the dark world, knowledge that nobody else seems to fully possess. And because of his isolation, he doesn't even know how little other people know. He's utterly shocked to learn that Queen doesn't understand that creating another dark fountain within the dark world will bring about the roaring. And when confronted by Susie in Chapter 4, he breaks down and confesses that some of the things he knows are painful and he never wanted to know them. Despite all of this, however, there is another important aspect of Ralsei: his kindness. Ralsei is a very kind character, in part it seems because he chose to be, and he's even the one to introduce us to kindness as a central theme of the game by saying that while Susie seems troubled, you should try to be kind to her. He encourages the player to try kindness wherever you go, to be merciful and understanding. And he is ultimately vindicated time and again for this, which is something I'll come back to. It's this philosophy of kindness, along with his care for Susie and Kris, which brings us to the subject of King's Spade. Lancer's great-o-dad acts as the perfect foil to Ralsei, as they really could not be more different. The king is bitter, angry and violent. Where Ralsei shows great reverence for Lightners, the king actively despises them and holds a grudge for their abandonment of his subjects. He even dismisses Ralsei's talk of peace as simple-minded platitudes. He's made to contradict Ralsei in every way, which makes perfect sense because the king is also meant to be a mirror to Susie. Really think about it, the king is almost a perfect parallel to Susie at the beginning of the game. They're both angry and both believe that violence is the solution to their problems. But it's also reflected in how both are honestly quite mean to Lancer upon introduction, but Susie eventually grows to truly value Lancer's friendship, and the king's actions are later recontextualized, and he becomes more openly affectionate towards his son. Hell, both the king and Susie threaten Kris with violence on the justification that quiet people piss them off. It doesn't get much more on the nose than that, but what makes him sympathetic, aside from his affection for his son, is that much like Susie, a lot of this is a defense mechanism. His anger and obstinance are masks for his pain and abandonment issues. None of this stems from him just being a dick, although he is a dick. And here's the thing, sympathetic is not the same as forgivable. If you still don't like the guy and you don't think any of this is an excuse for his actions, I'm right there with you. A lot of people conflate the two because they like to use sympathetic motivations as a way to excuse the horrible actions of their favorite characters, but that is not what I'm doing here, nor anywhere else in this video. A Freudian excuse is no excuse at all. I personally do not think the king's motivations make him any level of forgivable, but I do think they make him more than just an asshole, and that's what's important. The king makes for a simple foil to Ralsei, but that works because Ralsei is still a very simple character at this point, still largely undefined. But just as his face is finally revealed at the end of the chapter, Ralsei is quickly growing as a person, and it's all thanks to his interactions with his Lightner friends. Ralsei develops monumentally quickly in Chapter 2, and it begins the moment you re-enter the Dark World, where before he was very quietly kind and polite, here he comes out to greet you, says how much he missed you, and even gives Kris the task of collecting the other Darkners. He's also far more expressive now and will only become more so as the story progresses. What I think is interesting is that Ralsei often allows himself to be limited by expectation. We see this as early as Chapter 1 when he admonishes Susie for not acting like a hero, but it continues into Chapter 2 in how he responds to the Sweet Captain Cakes fight, in how fixated he is on the idea that Kris has to be the one to act and that it's the only way to win, right up until Susie literally forces him to learn how to act on his own, which is hilarious. Susie and Ralsei honestly have a really great dynamic in that she defies expectations and helps him grow, and he provides her with the emotional support she needs to grow as well. And it's through his relationship to Susie that we see Ralsei kind of learn what sarcasm is, learn that he really likes cake, and even learn uwu speak, which, I'm sorry Susie, but this is entirely on you. You should really have known better. But it's that idea of support that brings us to Queen and just fucking everything about her. I'd like to note, by the way, that for Chapter 2 and 3, I will not be considering how much the bosses give you the horn into what makes them sympathetic, even though I know that's a huge thing with a lot of people. Queen is perfectly designed to make the internet scream, "Step on me, mommy," and the moment Tumblr and the TikTok girlies saw Tenna's teeth, they started getting horny and weird. But keep it in your pants, you freaks. We've got analysis to do right now, and there'll be time for that later. I think Queen makes for an interesting foil to Ralsei, because while they both legitimately care about the Lightners, Ralsei's is in a distinctly caring and traditionally maternal way, while Queen's way revolves around control and presumptions built off incomplete data. Queen assumes that Lightners want to be told what to do. She thinks she knows everything about someone thanks to their search history, and she has no problem using force to get her way if she thinks it'll be what makes people happy in the end. Which honestly seems to be the basis of her treatment of Noelle. Noelle feels lost and in need of guidance. Queen doesn't want her to be sad, so she tries to control her as a means of guiding her towards happiness. Contrasting this, Ralsei also wants to make Susie and Kris happy, but in a far more hands-off way, offering them comfort and escapism instead. He also personalizes their rooms more, adding stars and trophies to Kris's room to remind them of Asriel and giving them space that they can build on themselves, offering a degree of freedom. Susie's room has a fully stocked fridge and a bunch of spiky and sharp things which he knows she loves. It's simple, but it's a sign that he's paying attention. Outside of their contrasting care models though, she also serves as his foil in terms of knowledge. As I said earlier, Ralsei has a perfect knowledge of the rules of the Dark World and the prophecy, and Queen basically knows jack shit, essentially working to copy the night because that's our only data point. She literally would have caused the end of the world if Ralsei hadn't stopped everyone from making that second Dark Fountain, and I think the way that this reveals just how little the other rulers understand about the nature of the Dark Fountains is really well done. Also, Queen is the first person to make him make this face, and that's delightful. Honestly, I think a big reason why Queen ends up being so sympathetic and beloved is that she is just the single kookiest character in the entirety of the game. The woman is a fucking nut job of manic energy and drunken lunacy, and she's just the most fucking fun character, start to finish. But beyond that, I think what makes Queen so interesting is her light world parallel. If you've been in the Deltarune fandom for a while now, you may be familiar with the Universal Mother Theory, which states that Queen is meant to act as a reflection of each of the Lightner's mothers. And while I do think there's merit to the theory, I actually think she's most reflective of Toriel, an exaggerated reflection akin to a funhouse mirror, much like Tenna and the King, but a reflection nonetheless. Queen actually parallels Toriel in a lot of ways, from her usage of pet names, which reflects how Toriel calls Kris my child and honey, to how she basically adopts Lancer, just as Toriel adopted Kris. She even parallels Toriel in how they both attempt to make homes for Kris, Toriel through the book How to Care for a Human, and Queen from their search history. But a really big one, and this is a connection we don't learn of until chapter 4, is Toriel's drinking problem. Now, this is not me saying Toriel is an alcoholic, by the way. She doesn't drink nearly enough on screen for us to make that claim with any level of certainty. But Toriel definitely has a history of losing control when drinking, such as when she blasted Rudolph across the room with a key lime pie, and indeed when she got drunk and partied with Sans at the end of chapter 4. This is admittedly just my own biased reading of the situation, but Kris's reaction to walking in and seeing Toriel drunkenly dancing isn't just embarrassment. It has an air of, oh god, not again. I think Kris has definitely walked in on their mother in a similar state before, and I really don't think they wanted Susie to see her like that. And not for nothing, but we very rarely see Queen without a glass in her hands. She even comments at one point that she might have had too many, and if we're being honest, a lot of her behaviour does come across as drunken antics. And all of this continues to make her an excellent foil to Ralsei, who doesn't drink, has no control over his subjects, and is more concerned with making people comfortable. And none of this serves to make Queen an unsympathetic character, nor do I intend to imply Toriel is a bad mother, but it all does serve to make Ralsei more sympathetic in comparison. And then came chapter 3 and 4, which just kicked our poor boy in the snout and danced across his miserable face. Ralsei reveals that he cannot come to the festival like Susie wants and confirms what anyone who was paying attention already figured out. Darkners are the realised forms of normal objects, and can only appear as people in the dark world. Something that, again, he knows but few others seem to. And this knowledge of his inherent nature has clearly coloured his self-perception, and this is what contrasts him to Tenna more than anything else. I find Tenna's nature as Ralsei's foil in this chapter fascinating because it largely exists in the contrast of their perceived self-worth. Ralsei believes that he and all Darkners only exist to fulfill the purpose of making Lightners happy, and that it is their fate to be eventually discarded. He has resigned himself to eventually being thrown away by Susie and Kris when he no longer serves a purpose that he has built his entire identity around. He doesn't even believe he should be allowed to have feelings on the matter. calling himself selfish for wanting more and being afraid of losing his friendship with the other members of the fun gang, which just Angel's tits, Ralsei, why do you hurt me like this? In contrast to Ralsei, Tenna appears to have incredibly high self-worth, seeing himself as completely indispensable to the Dreamer family, to the point where he seems not just angry about being left off, but downright offended by the idea that they could live without him at all. But at the same time, I think it's pretty clear this is a coping mechanism. Tenna's very clearly insecure and in denial about his own technological obsolescence, denying that he has burn-in, insisting that watching TV can teach you as much as going to college, and generally struggling to understand why he was left alone at all. And all of this is made even more tragic when you realise who he's meant to parallel. Tenna is a mirror to Asgore. Really think about it. Both struggle to adapt to the new situation they find themselves in, and both desperately want to return to the time before the divorce, to rewind the clock and fix everything. It's actually really sad when you think about it. Asgore constantly pursues Toriel with the intent of getting back together, declaring his desire to return to normal before Asriel comes home. But life now is the new normal, and you can't simply turn back the clock. Tenna, likewise, just wants to return to the time where he could make the family happy, and to that end, he's desperately trying to remind Kris of the good times they had with him. Watching holiday specials, gaming with Asriel, watching music videos they definitely weren't supposed to with Des. He brings each of these up in the hopes of reminding Kris of the joy he brought, but just like Asgore, he's alarmingly ignorant of the pain that he might be causing Kris in his pursuits. There are more parallels between the two men, such as their shared obsession with Toriel, their shared flower features, and the fact that neither are very good bosses or businessmen. But I honestly keep coming back to just one moment, and that's when La Niña and El Niña are having their mid-battle lovers spat and subsequent breakup, where he says, "It's normal for couples to fight, right, Kris?" Now, this is obviously a horribly tone-deaf thing to say to a child of divorce, especially one who's still in the process of mourning the loss of their family's stability, but whenever I see this line brought up, I always have to wonder, how many times did Asgore tell this to Kris during the divorce proceedings? And how many times was he saying it to convince himself? Ralsei and Tenna both have the main goal of making Kris and Susie happy, but they have very different ideas of what that entails. Ralsei seems to think that accepting that all darkness will be thrown away and forgotten one day is for the best, while Tenna holds on so tight that he actively hurts people. But as declared by Susie, both are wrong. They shouldn't accept being thrown away, and there will always be a place for them. And for Tenna, that place just isn't where he thought it would be. I think it's very clear that Ralsei suffers from extreme self-worth issues, and as someone who both suffers from that myself and has had friends who do, this hits especially hard. One of the hardest parts of knowing someone who suffers from this is simply seeing the confusion in their eyes when you tell them that they don't need to earn your love, and that they do in fact deserve it. Because they genuinely do not believe it to be true, and it's heartbreaking. And I think this is why it takes so long to convince Ralsei of it, even with Susie's genuine and aggressive love for him, because it takes time in real life too. He needs time to learn to believe it himself. He needs time to adjust to that way of thinking. And even when he does, he'll still struggle with it. This is why he never gives himself his own room, why he's never even tried any of his own cakes before, and why he's so adamant that he should be the one to suffer instead of Kris or Susie, because in his mind, they matter and he doesn't. This brings us back to the subject of identity, because I think it's important that Ralsei says that he doesn't quite know what it means to be Ralsei-like. Remember, Ralsei starts this story empty, bereft of any experiences or purpose outside of his role in the prophecy, and all of his choices were made with Kris and Susie in mind. He learned to cook and sing and sew because he thought it would make them happy, but he's done nothing for himself, and that's why he's empty. A person is the culmination of their experiences and choices, and before meeting you, Ralsei had no experiences to speak of. And this is part of why he has nothing for himself. He says it outright. He believes his purpose, his reason for being, is to make Kris and Susie happy. And so he doesn't do anything for himself. He doesn't even know how good cake tastes because to him, the things he makes are for Kris and Susie, and he has no right to try them. I think this is even why he resembles Asriel so much, because Kris so desperately wants to see their brother, and Ralsei wants to make them happy. All of this, combined with their severe self-worth issues, is why Ralsei has nothing. He doesn't have a favourite food, he doesn't have a hobby just because he likes it, he doesn't even really have his own room. All he has is an empty space. However, he isn't empty anymore. Over the first 4 chapters of this game, Ralsei has grown tremendously, filling that emptiness in with shared experiences and the love of his friends. He's growing as a person, he's learning and trying new things, and he's even having his worth validated by Kris and Susie, who both remind him that it's okay to feel things and good to do things for himself. And I think this is why Ralsei is so terrified of coming across as weird for knowing too much, because he's afraid of losing the one good thing he has. He's afraid of driving his friends away, something I think we can all relate to. Ralsei only really seems to fear 2 things: losing his friendship with Kris and Susie, whether that's to his own weirdness or to the prophecy, and the roaring, which of course leads us to the Titan. You may think that this is where my theory falls apart, but no, the Titan still functions as an important foil to Ralsei. It represents his fear of the prophecy. Now, we don't know everything about it, but from context clues we can tell it very likely ends very badly for Susie, especially considering his absolute terror at the prospect of her seeing its conclusion. Side note, I am fully aware of the fan theories about the prophecy. Do not shout them at me in the comments because they are not relevant to this and I will not care. The Titan is both a symbol of despair and hope for Ralsei. Despair because it represents the darkest possible outcome, the destruction of both worlds and, more importantly, a massive threat to his friends. But it also represents hope because you destroy it. Together, you strike down the Titan and put a stop to the destruction prophesied by its creation, meaning that it might be possible to defy the prophecy and save Susie from her tragic end. This is something I'll come back to at the end of the video. But who does the Titan mirror, Titan? You said the bosses were parallels to Lighteners. Well, the answer is really quite simple, voice in my head. The Titan is a mirror to us and Kris. The Titan represents the potential horror that lies within our choices, specifically with the weird route. Think about it. The Titan is stated to be a force of pure destruction, devoid of any concept of mercy, and overflowing with a darkness so powerful it distorts the world. Now think back to the weird route, how it requires you to twist the rules of the game, tormenting Noelle and pushing her into slaughtering the other characters. How your influence breaks the rules of reality and corrupts everything. It's no coincidence that the shield protecting the Titan's face is the save symbol, because it represents what we could be. That we could always choose to start another save and see what happens if we choose cruelty over kindness. After all, if you could do it, doesn't that mean you have to? To see everything the game has, no matter what the consequences might be. I mean, if you really think about it, the lyrics of Don't Forget could have far more sinister connotations depending on who sings it. Don't forget I'm with you in the dark is closer to a threat than anything else if it's coming from the soul on the weird route. Ralsei may begin as an empty prince in a kingdom bereft of subjects, but he's becoming one of the most complicated and brilliantly lovely characters in a game already full of them. And I personally cannot wait to see how he grows in the coming chapters. I can only hope that he finally starts to see the value in himself that others do, and that he finally gets some fucking furniture. You know, I don't think anyone expected Susie to become the breakout character that she has. But that's what we get for underestimating Toby Fox, I suppose. Granted, she's also a lesbian and the internet loves lesbians, but obviously there's a lot more than that. Susie has actually developed into a truly complex and well-written character, which is all the more impressive for her, and let's be honest here, kind of terrible first impression. Some people still haven't forgiven her for bullying Kris at the start of the game, and that's fair. It's never really been addressed in-game, but I do think she's done more than enough to redeem herself, and it all starts with being kind. Much like the other members of the Fox Squad, there's a lot we don't know about Susie. But this time it's not because the narrator is hiding things like with Kris, or because she's still discovering the basics of who she is like Ralsei. No, Susie is simply closed off as a result of her troubled childhood, which isn't actually better and you could very easily argue is a bit worse, but it is simpler. Susie is a victim of neglect, that much is obvious, but I suspect she also comes from a pretty low income household. It's implied that she doesn't get fed enough at home due to how she's constantly hungry and oddly considers that being able to eat a breakfast like Toriel's is a sin. Her clothes are generally worn and torn, and she doesn't even bother to call her parents for permission to stay overnight, which implies her parents either do not care or simply won't notice that she isn't home. To be clear, I'm not claiming her parents are cruel, we simply do not know enough about her situation at home to say. But at the very least, we do know that her physical and emotional needs are not being adequately met. And while there are quite a few possibilities as to why they might be, neglect is still a form of abuse. And I think this parental neglect is why she seemingly ends up idolizing Toriel, which I'll come back to later. As I said, there isn't a lot we know for certain about Susie's home life. But while there are things we can infer from her dialogue and from the way she seems happy to put off going home or even letting us know much about it, we do know that she's moved around a lot, and that it's one of the reasons she's never had many friends. And this is what brings us to a core aspect of Susie's character: loneliness. Susie is an incredibly lonely character, starting the story, much like Kris, completely isolated from the people around her. And while you may think that it's because she's a bully, I'd argue that's only part of it. The thing you need to understand about Susie is that the bullying thing is a very late development, and it's only something she does as a result of how she's been treated. Because while she's aggressive and sometimes violent, Susie isn't cruel by nature. That's a defense mechanism. And for the record, I'm not saying any of this is an excuse for her actions. I'm merely giving an explanation for why she ended up the way she did. What's incredibly obvious about Susie is that she's had a rough childhood. She was mistreated by other kids who would pretend to be her friends to mess with her. She was treated as an unwanted pest by adults and neglected by her parents. When she did manage to make friends, she would move and lose them, and even in hometown she's been treated poorly from the start, with people acting scared of her because of her size and appearance, and not from anything she actually did. It's also pretty clear that Susie struggles in school and isn't given the help that she needs to keep up with the class. And if you're familiar with public schools, then you know that kids like that tend to get labeled as troublemakers and treated differently by the adults before they receive any help, which also leads to the other kids treating them differently, and it's just a vicious cycle of bullshit. I think that Susie's anger, aggression, and general violent tendencies at the start of the game are all part of a defense mechanism. They are a learned behavior. The thing about abuse and bullying is that people learn to cope with them differently, because just living with it isn't something you can really do. I was bullied horribly in middle school and no one was helping me, so the way I learned to deal with it was with hit and run tactics, to strike them at the first sign of aggression and then run somewhere that they couldn't chase me. I essentially had to learn to use my school's neglect of anything not happening directly in front of someone's face to my advantage. But Susie's learned behavior is obviously to bite first, to make herself seem like too much of a problem to be worth messing with in the first place. And while this has the obvious effect of isolating her from others, well, she was already being isolated just by existing. This would merely be a form of taking control and having it happen on her terms. And yeah, she'd clearly end up biting at perfectly nice people, but in her mind it would be worth it because it would mean that she'd made herself too much of a threat for people to want to hurt. So she closed herself off and put up an intimidating air, not just to keep people away, but to convince herself that she's better off alone. This is why she's so aggressive at first, why she won't listen to people and lashes out at everyone and everything. She's learned that it's the only way to keep herself safe, because if nobody else is going to be kind to her, why should she expect it, or even try to be kind herself? But all of this changes when she befriends Lancer, one of the few people to consistently treat her with any level of kindness. And he also meets her on her level. He's a weird kid who doesn't fit in, and she's a weird kid who doesn't fit in, but they fit together pretty well, and that, much like with Kris, is kind of the basis of their friendship. And this is why she can't go through with fighting him and ultimately decides to start acting with the party. She doesn't actually want to hurt people, she just doesn't want to get hurt herself. And so she begins to open up to the idea that she doesn't need to fight to protect herself, which allows her to open up to her friends and let them get to know the real her. And the real Susie is a delight. Yeah, she's aggressive and intimidating, but she's also sweet and goofy and caring. She stands up for people, she helps them see their own worth, and she's so fucking kind to her friends. She's also just a silly little ridiculous gremlin child, making up poems about old french fries, pouring juice directly into Kris's mouth, making plans to co-parent a severed hand with Noelle. It's all just goofy kid stuff and it's great. Susie grows so much over the course of the game, and I love that about her. I love that she learns to let her guard down and to cherish the people around her. I love that she'll let people say what they want about her, but the moment someone insults Kris, she's ready to throw down. I love that she immediately starts referring to objects by their darker names once Ralsei reveals the nature of the Dark World. I know some people don't like that she's yet to apologise for bullying Kris, and that's fair, but I think she will. Susie has, for better or worse, begun to realise that she has an impact on the lives of those around her, especially on the people she cares about. And while she's spent the first 4 chapters slowly becoming more comfortable being herself around Kris and Ralsei, she's also spent the time growing as a character, and it's largely due to the influence of those around her. It's thanks to her friendship with Kris and Ralsei and Lancer, the burgeoning romance she has with Noelle, and last but not least, her relationship with Gerson. Gerson actually serves an incredibly important role in Susie's character development because he acts as her guide. He's pretty obviously enjoying trolling her in his first appearance, but he plays an incredibly important role as the first adult to believe in her. Kids who have been deemed troublemakers like Susie tend to get left behind or forgotten by the adults around them, especially teachers who feel it's better to prioritize the kids they think are actually behaving. And because of this, a lot of kids in Susie's position end up struggling more and more, and they often don't have the words or the experience to request the help they need. And this is partially due to how overwhelmed and underpaid teachers are, but that's a discussion for another day. What's important is that Garrison sees that Susie is a kid in need of guidance, and so he gives it. Garrison spends a lot of time in Chapter 4 interacting with Susie and both encouraging and challenging her, prompting her to try harder when she's ready to give up. And this is actually best exemplified in her use of healing magic. Her ultimate heal is basically played as a joke in Chapter 2 and not even really touched upon in Chapter 3, but in Chapter 4 she becomes aware of just how incomplete her healing is, and while she wants to get better, she pretty much just gives up because Ralsei is just that much better at it than she is, and because he unknowingly discourages her by automatically healing people before she's given the chance to, unwittingly becoming a reflection of the better piano player from before and killing her motivation to even try to get better herself. After all, if she'll never be as good as him, then what's the point? This is where Garrison plays a pivotal role, provoking her into using her healing magic and curing Jackenstein's pain when Ralsei couldn't, which serves to reignite her will to try again. Susie's application of healing magic is different from Ralsei's, and so it allows her to heal in a different way, something she'd never have known if Garrison hadn't provoked her to try again. Okay, can I just gush for a moment? I fucking love Garrison in this game. Like, it's obvious that his many years of experience are what give him the perspective he needs to help Susie, but the way he does it, provoking her, challenging her, providing her with tools and talking to her like an equal and without ever talking down to her, he's the fucking best, holy shit. Him originally being a blacksmith is so fitting because all of his interactions after you return to his study, and not just with Susie but with all of the party members, they all serve to build the characters up and strengthen them in some way. He's doing for Susie what her friendship does for them, and that's fucking incredible. Also, his music is so fucking spot on. He's obviously meant to be a parallel to Undyne and her whole Spear of Justice thing, and yeah, but the vibe of it all is so uniquely good. His bass theme invokes the feeling of being left with your grandparents for a weekend and being excited because you know you're going to get to do something you never get to do at home. And the theme for his study makes me think of falling asleep after a long day of doing things with my grandma. It's so good. But I think his battle theme is the best because it's a direct contrast to Undyne in Undertale. Undyne's themes were all hype tracks based around defiance and passion, and Hammer of Justice is also a hype song, but specifically to hype you up, to hype Susie up and keep her going. It's a track that says, "Hey, you almost got me that time, try again champ," without ever feeling condescending. And it fits the battle itself because Garrison is specifically using it to train Susie. His attacks deal less damage the lower your health gets because he wants you to succeed, but he's not just gonna hand you victory, you've gotta earn it. And the whole thing is basically one big final lesson for Susie, and it's all so good and I love this game, holy shit. Also, if you're as bad as I am at the fight, her healing magic becomes more powerful and efficient before your very eyes. It's actually kind of amazing because we get to watch Susie become kinder and more sincere and more open in real time over the course of the chapters, and she goes from being a terror to others and a burden upon your battle strategy to almost solely driving the emotional force of the story, becoming almost the linchpin of the group. We get to see just how important kindness is because we're allowed to watch her grow from being shown it for the first time, and I think that's great. Finally, I want to touch back on what I said about Susie seemingly idolizing Toriel. We actually get inklings of this at the start of the game, where she cites making Toriel sad as the reason she doesn't bite Kris's face off, but it becomes far more obvious at the end of Chapter 2, when Toriel invites her to spend the night and she gets weirdly formal about the whole thing, worrying about what Alphys has said about her and seemingly scandalized by Toriel swearing. We actually find out why this is in the latest chapters, as she reveals that Toriel found her crying on a bench one day and comforted her. I believe Susie sees Toriel as the mother she wishes she had, as an ideal, which is why she was so clearly upset by witnessing Toriel's drunken state. The illusion was shattered and she, like a lot of players now that I think about it, realized that Toriel is an imperfect parent. A big part of growing up is realizing that your parents and your heroes are just as human and fallible as anyone else, and this is a sad realization Susie has just been forced to confront. I'm looking forward to seeing where this takes her, as she seems more determined than ever at the end of Chapter 4, but only time will tell. Okay, we're moving on. God, there's just so much I could keep saying about this game and the characters, but I understand when a video is getting too long, and that point was a half hour ago. But I might do a video on the game's supporting cast, comment down below if you'd like to see that. I'm curious who would be interested. You may remember about 11 pages ago when I said that Ralsei is ultimately vindicated in his philosophy of kindness, and I stand by that statement. See, while the game is quick to inform you that your choices don't matter, that's not actually true because you do change the outcome of the chapters by being kind, because the characters remember your kindness and respond accordingly. If you go through the painstaking effort of warning every enemy about Susie's attacks in chapter 1, they all come forth to overthrow the king and rescue you, rather than Ralsei having to pacify the king. It may seem like a small change, but it's a significant one in the grand scheme of things, because you've changed their hearts and won their help. They literally defy their own ruler because they recall how much compassion you showed them and they don't want to see you get hurt. And this is something that you see in every chapter. In chapter 2, Berdly gathers the friends you made along the way to help build the thrash machine, and the more you've spared and recruited, the higher the base health. In chapter 3, the enemies will straight up say they don't want to fight you, and if you don't recruit enough of them, then Tenna actually dies because Susie can't find enough to help her repair him. And in chapter 4, Jagenstein and the others help you to climb up to the knight, saying that you helped them so it's their turn to help you. And the thing is, I don't think this is just an alternate chapter ending. I think this is foreshadowing for the end of the game. I don't normally do this because this isn't a theory channel, but I would actually like to posit my prediction for how the story is going to go. Ralsei states that he hoped that being kind enough would change the outcome of the prophecy, but he despairs when he sees that it remains unchanged. The thing is though, I do think your kindness can change the outcome. I think that, while the events listed in the prophecy have to come to pass, the outcome can be changed. After all, the prophecy says that Tenna will be cleaved red by blade, which the visuals and words imply to be fatal, and while he does get cleft, he still survives if you recruited enough people to help rescue him. I think what will happen is, if you choose to remain a pacifist and face each enemy with kindness, then at the end they will come forth to save Susie from whatever horrible fate is in store for her. I think she will literally be saved by the kindness she's shown other people, and this would be so incredibly fitting because she's already been saved by kindness, by Toriel and Kris and Ralsei, by being given care and love, just as she's saved them with her friendship. Deltarune is a story about the power of kindness, about how we save others and are saved ourselves by acts of compassion and care, about how understanding and a gentle push can make the world a better place. And while it's already a fantastic game, I think that by the time it's done, it's going to be something truly and uniquely great. Thank you for watching, and a huge thanks to my patrons for their support, especially Tetraphobe49, Owen Oofs, Wisteria, and Lustrous Lizard. I've been kind of taking a break this month to rest up and regain my energy for my channel anniversary video next month, so this video took a lot longer to make than it normally would. I'm still pretty proud of it though. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you're getting as much out of the new Deltarune chapters as I am, because I fucking loved them. Anyway, I've got another video to get started on, so I'll see you guys in a week or so, and I hope you have a lovely day. Bye!